There's a lot of in-depth video game content out there on the internet. From 40-minute histories to hours-long reviews of every little detail, you can find rich, detailed content about almost every game under the sun, if you're willing to look for long enough. These videos, though, aren't going to be like that. In this series, I'm going to be looking at some of the greatest and most influential games, developers, moments, and tech in the history of the video game industry, and breaking them down so you can learn all about your favourites without having to set aside a whole hour in your schedule for it. We're going to start from the very beginning of gaming. I'm Lord Theranis, and welcome to Pong in 10-ish minutes. See what I did there? Almost every gamer out there has at the very least heard of Pong. Released in 1972, the common perception is that Pong was the first ever video game, and it took the world by storm with its magical computerized gameplay. But whilst Pong was certainly one of the first commercial games, and definitely the first successful one, its concept dates back nearly 20 years before fledgling Atari programmer Alan Alcorn put fingers to keyboard. The idea of playing a game using a computer dates back as early as 1950, before many computers even had electronic screens. These early games weren't for entertainment purposes. They were about showing off what the rapidly growing computer science sector could do in ways the public could easily understand. It's much easier to watch a computer play noughts and crosses or drafts, tic-tac-toe or checkers if you're a filthy colonial rebel, than it is to watch a computer try and do complex maths or such. They originally used lights to represent squares on a board, but they quickly moved on to electronic screens, and it didn't take long for the idea of a tennis game to be thought of and then proved possible. In 1958, William Higginbotham at the Brookhaven National Laboratory came up with what's thought to be the first game created solely for entertainment, Tennis for Two. In some ways, Tennis for Two is a more faithful recreation of ping pong than Pong. It included the ability to hit the net, for example. Exact specifics aside, though, that makes it clear that Pong wasn't a brand new revolutionary concept. But it didn't have to be. What made Pong such a groundbreaking success wasn't the ideas behind it, but their implementation, and the people behind that. The idea of Pong originates with two men, Nolan Bushnell and Ted Dabney. Bushnell and Dabney were the men behind the actual first commercially designed video game, Computer Space. Computer Space was a space combat game inspired heavily by Space War, another early 1960s game designed and run on MIT's mini-computers. That had proved an instant hit among the students and employees of the institution. By building a machine specifically to run their game and nothing else, Bushnell and Dabney hoped to provide a similar experience to Space War, but without the astronomical costs associated with computers of the time. When it released in 1971, Computer Space was a modest success, but nothing like Bushnell and Dabney had hoped. It turns out the things that interest MIT students and faculties aren't quite aligned with what the average Joe in a bar wants to play. Who'd have thought? So Bushnell and Dabney went back to the drawing board. They split from the manufacturers and promoters they'd been using to produce Computer Space, and founded their own company, Atari, to produce and retail their products entirely in-house. Then, enter once more Alan Alcorn, Atari's first employee, and the man who actually built Pong. Alcorn took a prototype ping-pong game that Bushnell had developed, and as he expanded on it, it immediately became apparent that Atari had everything they needed for a hit on their hands. Space Wars, and with it Computer Space, had been a complex simulation of a space battle. It was made by highly intelligent physicists to be enjoyed by their peers. Even with the pared-down version of the systems that Computer Space provided, the grasp of astrophysics and rocket science you needed to really enjoy it was far beyond the knowledge levels of the general American public. When you combine that with the fact that these early games were very strictly two-player, they were built to barely run the game itself with player inputs, let alone developing a form of reactive AI, you can see why it struggled to take off. No pun intended this time. Pong, on the other hand, was perfect in its simplicity. Like its predecessor 15 years ago, you could understand at a glance what was happening in a game of Pong. But its minimalistic yet emphatic sound effects meant that you might not even have to look at all. Pong was easy to pick up and play. Gameplay was as simple as turning a dial to move your bar on the screen. Practically anybody could grab a friend for a quick game of Pong, even if they'd never touched it before, and they'd easily be able to understand what they were doing. And then, perhaps most importantly to its success, Pong was cheap. All you needed between two players to enjoy a game of Pong was a single quarter. Now that was worth more in 1972 than it is now, but it still was not an expensive amount of money. With the new, exciting technology that Pong represented, it's easy to see why people enjoyed it. Pong hit the market in 1972, a year after the disappointment of computer space. It proved about as instant a success as you'll ever see in business. American audiences couldn't get enough of it. It sold 8,000 units in its first couple of years of production. That might seem small by modern standards, but in the 1970s, in an area of business that nobody had ever really heard of, in a market that didn't exist, that was a nearly unheard of level of success. And Pong ramped up quickly. A few years later, it was producing 150,000 cabinets. But Pong's influence doesn't just stop at the US. Businesses across America, Europe, and Japan saw what Atari had made, and they saw that they had a simple, easy-to-replicate formula for a highly successful product. And so, they set about making their own versions of Atari's star product. Within the year, companies across the globe were at it, producing these new, amazing products for a brand new industry, all about these things called video games. Pong might seem like an absurdly simple, ridiculously low-tech experience to modern audiences. Even by the standards of the time, it was quickly surpassed. Space Invaders in 1978 is a vast improvement, and by the time Pac-Man is released less than 10 years after Pong's debut, it looks like a complete dinosaur in comparison. But you really can't overstate just how important Pong is to the history of video games. Pong established a brand new market, all on its own. Almost every household in the US might have had a television system, but the idea of using that system interactively and having it respond in real time? Well, there's a reason those early video games were produced by cutting-edge scientific institutes. Pong paved the way for hundreds of different companies. It practically single-handedly created an industry that nearly completely wiped out the at the time flourishing pinball industry. It inspired competition, produced new ideas, and most importantly, it showed an entire generation that they could make their career out of making amazing entertainment experiences through computing. Without Pong, the entirety of the video game industry might never have existed. At least not as we know it now. And that is Pong in 10-ish minutes. I might have let myself get the video length wrong just because I wanted to put that pun in. My time is up though, so I will leave you with this to ponder until next time. When you're playing Pong, are you looking at it from above, moving side to side? Or are you looking at it side on, moving up and down? I've been Lord Theranis, and thank you very much for listening.